By reflecting like this, our mind will be suffused with happiness, that the suffering we feel through the senses will become almost imperceptible and incapable of disturbing our mind. So when your practice reaches to a certain level, it then appears that suffering is not that great anymore. Just like for those of you who never studied Dharma, you were probably suffering quite a bit. But after studying quite profoundly and practice quite profoundly, you would think that, wow, I was really stupid. I was so confused then. I was so very naive. But now facing afflictions and suffering is very easy for me. Just like there are people who have money and lots of capacity. Before they study the actual pithing instruction, they would be suffering quite a bit. However, with the practice, their uncertainty and insecurity will ease, and there will be more happiness for them. According to the aphorism, it says that at the beginning, people would study because of fear, and when there is at first, people studied because of fear. Eventually, when fear appears, you can face it fearlessly. Also, in Bodhisattva Charyavatara, it says that the bodhisattvas, although would encounter difficulties and sufferings, but their virtue would increase without the increase of unvirtuous deeds. People would say, so and so used to hurt them quite a bit, and so and so made that person very depressed and so on. But if you can practice to transform happiness and suffering into the past, then whatever other people did to you is not going to create any harm. That is because this is the point at which sickness can be overcome through forbearance. It's worth noting that this is also an indication as to whether difficulties brought about by enemies, harmful spirits, and so on can be overcome. This part is a little bit different than the chapter of forbearance in Bodhisattva Charyavatara, because in the Bodhisattva Charyavatara it talks about a kind of forbearance where you have to bear it, you have to be very patient. If I have an enemy at the beginning, when that person started to harm you, would think that, well, this kind of harm brings me joy. If you can contemplate in such a way, how could other people harm you? This is the method that is taught over here in this text. So the previous two methods are different. And same applies to harmful spirits. Even harmful spirits and maras would want to harm you, and you are suffering quite a bit. But if you accept this suffering with wholeheartedness, then they cannot do anything to harm you at all. We often say that to use poison to fight over poison whenever suffering comes and harmful beings try to harm you, when there are beings trying to harm you, if you are looking for such harm and suffering, then you would think, wow, this is a great opportunity. Then in such a way, with such a direct penetration, then the harmful spirits and sickness cannot hurt you at all. Of course, you have to practice it. Otherwise, simply saying it is not going to help you practically. as we have already seen, reversing the attitude of not wanting to suffer is the whole basis for transforming suffering into our spiritual path. To eliminate the kind of thinking of I do not want to suffer, which means that the majority of sentient beings do not want to suffer. They all want happiness, but we need to then eradicate the thinking of I don't want suffering. This is the basis. And over here it talks about 2 points. One is to eradicate the thinking of I don't want to suffer. The second one is whenever suffering comes, I would be happy. So the first one is the basis, that is to transform suffering into practice. If without this, you would be quite scared of it. This is because we simply won't be able to turn suffering into the path as long as anxiety and irritation continues to eat away at our confidence and disturb our mind. The more we arrive at actually transforming suffering into the path, to directly transform it, the more we will enhance and reinforce all our previous practice. This is because our courage and good humor will grow all the more once we can see from our experience how suffering causes our spiritual practice and qualities to blossom. At the time, without encountering any problems, we could probably never practice. Because when people don't encounter problems or obstacles, they can never be awakened. They would never know what samsara means. They would never know how to practice renunciation. Sometimes I think we really need to be grateful for all the wrong image that is depicted by our media nowadays in terms of how monastics are. Because there are people nowadays who would watch TV and movies and so on, and look at how people would search spiritual paths and get ordained whenever they encounter suffering. And then when suffering actually occurs to those people would naturally think of finding an old monk in a monastery and talk about their suffering. So at the beginning, maybe you really wanted to eliminate suffering, but after hearing the teachings from Dharma teacher, you would think that, oh, maybe this is what I should do in terms, this is what I should do to work with the suffering. And then maybe you can become a great master, a great practitioner, even attain rainbow body in one lifetime. So you never know. I don't think that's the purpose of directors or the screenwriters, but that definitely helps people to step onto the path, onto the virtuous path of practice. So after encountering suffering and problem, your virtuous roots will ever grow. Therefore, you should remember, the more suffering, the more happiness, or the more suffering, the more appreciation. So I think you should remember it. We should have a very different way of looking at suffering. I think we used to think in such a way, the more happiness would encourage you to have more happiness. But today, I'm going to encourage you to think in such a way, the more suffering, the more happiness. The more other people would say that, the happier I would rejoice other people's happiness to gain more merit. But I think you should also rejoice other people's suffering. In this way, we can also enhance our practice as well. It is said that by training gradually with smaller suffering step by step in easy stages, then in the end we'll be able to handle bigger suffering and difficulties too. We must go about it like this because it is extremely difficult to have an experience of something which is beyond our level of capacity. Because maybe at the beginning, if you encounter great difficulties right away, to transform it right away at the very beginning, it will be difficult because your mind stream is not completely trained yet, is not at that level yet. It will be difficult. So at the beginning, maybe you have a little headache, and maybe people slander you or criticize you a bit, and maybe you don't feel very well mentally, emotionally. Then that's the time you should think this kind of suffering is really wonderful. I should accept it with great appreciation and enthusiasm. And after practicing slowly in this way, whatever habit you had built by slowly practicing this way, you can cultivate a new habit. Whatever you familiarize yourself with, would eventually become your great habit. Therefore, you should eradicate the harmful habits at the beginning. That is stated by Bodhisattva Charyavatara. So at the beginning, if you can familiarize yourself with small sufferings, and slowly you will familiarize yourself to face and accept suffering with great appreciation eventually. This kind of education is quite important. This kind of familiarization is very important. At the beginning, of course, it's very difficult because it's very different than how we used to think. It's very different than our habitual ways of thinking. We don't want to have suffering, and we want to have only happiness. So we really need to transcend that kind of habitual thinking. We should accept the suffering, and we should be willing to accept the suffering because it's more valuable to us.